red light and you're good to go.
Hi everyone, this is Jonathan Smith. I am the Executive Director of the Yakima County Development Association and want to welcome you to the COVID-19 Manufacturing Recovery and Preparedness webinar. This program is being conducted live on Friday, May 15th, and it's about 10 a.m. We're excited to join with the Greater Yakima Chamber of Commerce, Yakima SHRM, and the Center for Business Development to present this webinar. All those are local associations, organizations that work every day, even non-COVID-19, to help local businesses to be profitable, to be successful, and excited to join with Impact Washington, another organization that works across the entire state with that same kind of a mission. So we believe that having a plan to prepare your facilities to restart, develop your capabilities to operate is essential to meet the needs of your customers and getting your employees back to work. And this is really where the experts from Impact Washington come in. Their team has helped hundreds of small and medium-sized producers and manufacturers across Washington state to boost productivity, increase profitability, cut costs, raise employee morale, train their workforce, and just in general become more competitive on a global scale. So really quick though, before we kick off, what do we mean by a producer or a manufacturer? So this in Washington state, and Impact Washington defines this as anyone that produces a good or does a value added activity to a product. So obviously all manufacturers, but we also have distilleries, packaging, crating, labeling, fruit and food producers, assembly operations, and more. So some of the companies Impact Washington has worked with that you might recognize here in the Yakima Valley and in the ag industry include Crunch Pack, Yakima Chief Hops, HR Spinner, and Portco Packaging, among others. So if you aren't sure if your business is a producer or manufacturer, follow up with us or with the team at Impact Washington, because we want to err on the side of offering assistance. So that leads me right into my introduction of Rich Hodges. He's Impact Washington's account executive for Central and Eastern Washington. I've worked with him for a number of years with a number of different companies here. He's been very responsive and very helpful in providing information, guidance on those things that I mentioned before, where they help companies to cut costs, increase profitability, train workforce, etc. So Rich really is our go-to person for all of Impact Washington's programs. And I'm going to turn it over to him and he'll introduce today's speakers and the presentation.
All right, well, thank you, John. Good morning, everybody. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Rich Hodges, and I'm the what we call AE, or Account Executive for Eastern Washington, as John said. AE's job is to maintain the relationship with our clients and prospective clients in our territories, as well as to bring the best fit resources to serve the client and to act as a program manager. So we kind of have a threefold job. Go on to the next slide, please. So Impact Washington offers our clients a wide variety of things, from ERP and cybersecurity to strategic planning and plant automation. Historically, a large portion of what we have done is to help with productivity by helping teach lean principles and establish a culture of continuous improvement in the organizations. The last couple of years, we've seen a growing need for workforce development and leadership training. Impact Washington is part of a national network, which is called the Manufacturers Extension Partnership. It is organized under NIST, which is a National Institute of Standards and Technologies, and way before that, Weights and Measures, if you can go back that far, if you're older like me. And there's at least one MEP center in all of 50 states, as well as Puerto Rico. And Impact Washington has been the MEP Center in Washington since 1997. As a nonprofit and one who is a partnership who gets public funds to help their manufacturing in our state, we're measured by impact and not profit. And so this is measured by a survey that goes to our clients after engagements, and it's a very important measurement for us, as well as it should be for every taxpayer, as well as a voice for feedback into the network. Currently, the network is about 14 to 1 on investment, impact on investment public funds. So we are a nonprofit, and we have every MEP center has a little different model. Ours is to have very senior account execs like myself and Jeff Lawrence, who I'm going to turn this over to for the presentation. We have, instead of a large number of direct employees, we have a broader network of resource providers or consultants that we use to deliver whatever is needed by our clients. And so with that, I think I would like to, next slide, turn it over to Jeff. Jeff Lawrence is our account executive in the Tacoma area. Jeff, take it away.
Hi, Rich. Thanks a lot for the introduction, and thanks for hosting, John. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the offering that we have for assessments related to back to work and back to work safely for COVID-19. We and our large network of resource partners are offering support to manufacturers in this time of uncertainty, providing no-cost guidance on recovery preparedness for continuing or returning to operations. What we're going to talk about basically is go over the assessment a little bit and what that involves. We're going to talk about high-level steps for site and facility compliances, discuss in a little bit of a very kind of shallow detail about best practices and housekeeping recommendations, of which we would go into in much greater detail in an assessment. An employer risk assessment to classify worker exposure, implementing workplace controls, and developing an exposure risk decision matrix for each specific location and each specific manufacturer or processor or packer or whatever the case might be, in order to have the confidence that you're able to return to work safely. And then we'll end it up with a Q&A session, just to address any specific questions that you might have. So the reason that we're doing this is that the NIST MEP centers received some funding through the $2 trillion CARE Act for pandemic response. And this has been intended to assist manufacturers in this time of uncertainty to continue to resume operations safely and confidently. Obviously, it's very important to protect the workforce, but also we're sensitive and empathetic with the needs and challenges of manufacturers or of the manufacturing managers and owners. It's an extremely challenging time for everyone involved. There are lots of questions that need to be answered. There are lots of issues that need to be addressed. So we're here to provide counsel and advice using systematic procedures based on best available information. So in this assessment, which is a free assessment because we have this funding under the CARE Act, we're actually rolling out the back to work assessment as the first part of a multi-pronged approach where we're going to be supporting manufacturers and processors and packers and so forth over the recovery phase of this COVID-19 exposure. We're starting with an assessment to help you get your workers and your operations back to work safely and confidently, and we're going to follow up with some other elements that are being developed now, and we'll keep you informed about that as those roll out. So the three high-step or high-level steps for site compliance are to review existing procedures, comment on facility best practices, and housekeeping recommendations, to conduct an employer risk assessment based upon employee positions or area exposure, and then work with the clients to assist in the implementation of workplace controls based upon risk of exposure. So in this review element, there are a number of steps, and this is where a lot of our effort will focus. In our discussion with the clients, we'll start out in the morning with an assessment, with this free assessment of having a high-level discussion where we talk with each individual client getting an idea about where they are, talking about existing procedures, and then mapping out an outline of how we'll go with the assessment. And then based upon that short kickoff meeting, we'll assign a resource partner to work with that facility. So some of the things that we do is assisting in developing a facility-wide communication plan, employee support and training. Some of the elements that may be included in this are encouraging plant leadership to observe and model measures that are put in place while reinforcing the importance of observing them to employees entering the plant. If there is an employee assistance program, helpline or program that's in place, it's a good thing to remind employees about this resource and what the services offer. Also, we encourage the manufacturers for them to encourage employees to recognize areas of practices that pose a risk and to process those quickly and provide mitigation strategies in these areas. Being sensitive to the needs of the employees is very important at this time. In terms of health screening best practices and recommendations, this is an area where our experts were able to answer a lot of tricky questions. Establish guidelines and train all employees and visitors on new COVID-19 related procedures. You've probably seen in the governor's guidance that this is one of the requirements for coming back to work, that there needs to be guidelines and training provided for visitors. And this is where we can help to give some guidance on putting those practices and that training in place. It's recommended to limit non-essential visitors from entering the facility, including perhaps other employees that are usually stationed at a different location. We all know about social distancing, and this can be either done with procedure or with possible engineering controls, which we'll discuss later. And in terms of meetings, it's encouraged, of course, not to have in-person meetings, but if you must have in-person meetings, to meet in a large room with at least 6 feet distancing from one another, keeping the meeting as short as possible. Good health habits. It's recommended that all visitors are logged in so they can be contacted if in the unfortunate instance that an outbreak should occur. And we encourage you to place posters around the building that support staying at home and sick. Obviously hand washing, and make sure that those are posted in strategic places around the location. In terms of some other specific facilities, measures, and controls, some of the common areas which we are able to identify and offer support on are entrance hallways for common spaces and for the production floor. There's discussion about the possibility of installing or activating auto open doors, or encouraging and making allowance for bumping doors open with a hip or using a foot on a kick plate, and possibly removing a door closure where possible, and keep doors open to allow employees to move between doorways without touching knobs when it doesn't impact safety, in order to minimize high touch areas. Employee clock in and clock out procedures. It's probably goes without saying to block off spacing when clocking in or clocking out. Many time clocks now have web-based features that can be operated through phone apps, or consider other inexpensive apps that employees could use to track time and submit to supervisors. And probably needless to say, but keep additional hand sanitizer or washing station near the time clock, as that is a high congregation and a high touch area if there is a time clock in use. Common tools, human machine interface devices such as keyboards, buttons, etc. should be sanitized between users. Standard tools like rakes, brooms, scrapers, or hand tools should be sanitized after each use, especially between 2 separate users. And recommending that personal items such as pens or Sharpies or cutting knives or whatever be issued individually to employees, or alternatively to sanitize them frequently and certainly between uses of separate individuals. There are some inherent risks in a shift change, and and we go on to discussions about staggering days, shifts, shift changes, breaks, and lunches to avoid grouping. There has been discussion with a lot of clients about identifying individuals that don't need to come into the production restrooms and do not need to use the same resources as a larger amount of employees. There's discussion about separating teams into smaller groups and isolate them to separate bathrooms and break areas if possible. A lot of clients have ordered Santa cans with sinks, and as the weather gets better, providing outside tables for additional break areas. And in some operations with employees working remotely, or at least some employees working remotely, determine if any office spaces can be repurposed for segregated lunch or changing areas. Same thing goes really for meal and break area activities. Staggering or using conference rooms or separate spaces to distance employees is discussed in our assessment, and probably goes without saying, but it's important to intensify sanitation of refrigerator handles, sinks, microwaves, faucets, and other high-touch areas, particularly in areas where people congregate. In office and clerical areas, separate and segregate office staff, ideally limiting one person per office space if required on site, and to allow 6 foot distancing. And additional considerations sometimes to limit non-essential visitors from entering the facility. And actually, very importantly, also that while there are people who are working remotely, make sure that you're looking at your cybersecurity provisions for each data access point via web, phone, or other electronic interfaces outside of each facility, firewall protection. So to help employers determine the appropriate cautions, OSHA has divided job tasks into 4 exposure levels: very high, high, medium, and lower. High and very high are likely related to healthcare and first responder professions, and most manufacturing and processing workers will likely fall into medium or lower risk categories. OSHA looks at basically 3 code requirements for workplace safety. The first is the general duty clause, which simply states that the employer has a duty to create a workplace free from risk and hazards to the degree possible. Bloodborne pathogens, this is targeted mainly toward healthcare and first responders. And this basically states the duty to prevent transfer of pathogens via bodily fluids. And of course, the other workplace controls and the major code requirements that provide appropriate PPE for the risks that are inherent in the workplace. So the conduct element of the high-level competence is to do a workplace evaluation on the basis of risk of exposure for specific operations. And this is divided up into really three sections: engineering controls. This could be ventilation, barriers, and physical layout of the plant or of the operation to minimize contact. The ventilation, we discuss possibly encouraging or considering increasing ventilation rates, installing perhaps new filters or higher efficiency filters. There are UV filters which are available that can be installed. So there's a discussion on this in our assessment as well. Other engineering controls is to evaluate separation surfaces to prevent cross-contamination in breathing air and consider implementing barriers to ensure 6-foot minimum spacing. Administrative controls, this is really the process and procedures and the best practices, and this is what we've been talking about previously, and that's really where a large amount of the discussion will go. And of course, the last part of the workplace controls of exposure risk and managing exposure risk is appropriate PPE for the conditions and the risk inherent to various employees, and to providing appropriate PPE and then ensuring that it's used properly. So this page is an example of a workplace risk assessment form that the assessment will work with our clients to help develop. And basically what we do is we look at every position, every job in the operation, and do a risk assessment for that operation. In this example, we show a shear press operator, outline the job duties, discuss the exposure risk, and then discuss the workplace controls based on the risk of that exposure. In this instance, engineering changes. Is there any layout necessary? Are there any barriers necessary? And it was determined that there are none that are needed at this time. Administrative. This is an important one. This is where a lot of the training and the discussion at the operation level will take place with employees, and that's to do training in social distancing, good health habits, spacing in lunchrooms, etc. And PPE, in this instance again, with the shear press operator, there is enough social distancing that there's no additional PPE required. However, we will counsel our clients to be sensitive to the needs of employees, and if PPE is desired, for example, face masks, that there's allowance to make that provided, or for that to be used. So we started out at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis. In fact, Washington was involved pretty heavily with the Department of Commerce, the governor's office, and others, serving as a matchmaker to identify critical needs and to mobilize manufacturers to produce those goods for high need items, particularly PPE. Now, FEMA has established a PPE exchange, which is presented in a simple dashboard to connect private sellers with private buyers. The users enter their own information and update is needed, and there's a link on this if you'd like more information on that. And again, this will be posted. This presentation will be posted on the website, on John's website, the YCDA website, and also on Impact Systems website. So if you would like to access this for these, if you're joining by phone and would like to access this, you can join that. Also, if the PPE or whatever it is you might be providing doesn't meet FDA standards, but could still be appropriate for use in an operation, or you don't get traction on the FEMA site, you can offer them through Amazon Business and Amazon.com. And here is some information for how to reach that site. So I'm going to turn it over to Rich Hodges again to answer some more questions and discuss more next steps, and then take some Q&A after that. So I'll hand it back over to Rich.
All right, thanks, Jeff. So hello, everybody again. I still want to reinforce what John said about we are trying to touch as many people as possible. So, the definition of manufacturer is not just the typical manufacturer, although that is definitely included, but distilleries, packaging companies, fruit and food producers, and anybody who creates or adds value to a product. Obviously, this information, which anybody can access and use, is useful to everybody. But the grant that we are using to roll this out to these clients is more specific, but we're trying to be as loose as possible. So if you're unknown, just contact us, and we will we will make sure we can do everything we can, or give you, lead you in the right direction if we can. So the first step you need to take if you do want to get this free assessment is to contact Impact Washington, and that's most easily done by emailing info@impactwashington.org. And you can also email your local AE. I am the AE for Eastern Washington, Jeff in Tacoma, but we have AEs throughout the state. My email is rhodges@impactwashington.org. It's R as in Richard, H for people who are on the telephone. There's not everybody is online. R as in Richard, H as in hotel, O as in Oscar, D as in Delta, G as in golf, E as in echo, S as in Sierra @impactwashington, all one word, .org. All right. So step 2 will be to your AE will get in contact with you after you put a request in, and we will go through some intake questions so we get a better understanding of you, your needs, what you've done so far, and where you're at and how it's affecting your business. And that will help us to match you up with the appropriate resource provider or consultant that will be most beneficial for you for the immediate term. And then we will get on their schedule, and the AE will manage between the two of you how that works and get on a schedule to do the audit. Generally, the audit it is comprised of a morning session that we do a virtual tour, either through Teams on a personal device or FaceTime if we have to. And that will give us an opportunity to see your workplace environments, different environments, and ask questions, and to get a good assessment. We'll then go through some Q&A at the end of that, and generally that takes, depending on the size of the facility, 2 to 2.5 hours. Later in that day, generally, sometimes the next morning, but usually later in that day, we'll schedule another 2-hour session to debrief and go through the report that the AE, that the resource providers created in between those times. So for takeaways, you get the report documenting your risk levels. You get the current efforts you're undertaking to mitigate risks, and a plan to proposed improvements based on discussions with a consultant. I encourage everyone to leverage the resource, as many manufacturers we work with have found it extremely helpful and reassuring. So as additional Impact Washington recovery programs come online, we will connect again with you, and doing this assessment will help us to know you and to be able to contact you when that happens. So before I open it up for questions, I guess I would say that this is being recorded, I believe, and I think you can access it simply by clicking on the same link that got you here, and you can share that link with others, and also go to our website or John's website to access the slides. So with that, does anyone have any questions? There is a question on the live meeting. There is a Q&A tab that you can hit and type in any questions you want.
And I'll go ahead and just read off a couple of these that have come through that have been answered. One question was, again, how you just clarified again on, is this just for manufacturing or does it cover other entities? The definition of manufacturing is, don't just think of somebody who's making widgets. There's a lot more that is covered there. Even folks who spend most of their time working on maintaining machinery and equipment inside of an industrial or commercial facility, may also be a manufacturer. So, however, having said that, YCDA and other partners are looking to do other seminars. Some are specifically going to be for retail or for restaurants, etc. So those will be coming, but the folks from Impact Washington here do have a broad range of the definition of manufacturing. So don't just think of someone who's like, bending metal or doing those kind of things, although that definitely does qualify. Another question that came was asking for the link for the Amazon link for PPE. We've definitely seen that be a challenge. We've been out visiting a lot of businesses, and I would say maybe 2 out of every 10 that we've been in, maybe 3 have been able to access enough PPE that they can make it mandatory for their employees. So that link will probably be made available following the meeting as well, so that other folks can see that. Accessing those materials is super important. Any other questions coming in? I don't see any. All right, with that, I will turn this back over to Rich, who will give us kind of a farewell and a reminder of the next steps that businesses can take to get in contact with Impact Washington.
All right, thanks, John. Hey, there are a couple of questions that I'll mention that have come up in the past that may be of interest. One is, do you have a time frame when the governor will lift the stay-at-home order? And that is obviously very important to all of us. The governor's mentioned several times in his briefings that the economy is akin to a dial and not a switch. And just yesterday, his office released phase 2 manufacturing facility requirements, which you can access on the governor.law.gov site with a few drill downs. We've seen several sectors present a plan to the governor, allowing them to reopen early, and we encourage you to work with your trade associations to show that you can manage restarting safely. Having this third-party review should go a long ways towards convincing others that you are prepared, and that they, if they are ever to enact a certification or a standard, then it'll get you well on your way to have met those requirements. Another question is, have you implemented this with other manufacturers? And yes, we only recently started this, but we've already done more than 40 manufacturers. And let's see, already talked about the virtual walkthrough. One question was, could you share an example of changes that were implemented as a result of speaking with the consultants? And every engagement is different, and every company of yours is different and has different requirements. So it is always interesting to see what the consultants and the companies come up with. There's been things like putting in porta potties and having solutions to handle third parties that are coming into the facility, or delivery people, and things like that weren't thought of before. So there's always something new, no matter how good. There's a lot of companies that have done a lot and have been working as an essential company, and there's always been suggestions and improvements that they were happy to receive. Last question that's common is, this is truly free? And yes, this is free. There is no match. There is no special requirements. The only requirement is that you agree you will answer a survey eventually, because this is public funds, and we are measured on how those monies are spent and that they're effective. So if you'd like to get started, email info@impactwashington.org or your local account executive. So with that, I'll let John close.
All right, thanks everyone again for joining us today. And thanks to our partners at Impact Washington, also the Greater Yakima Chamber of Commerce, the Yakima SHRM, and the Center for Business Development, all partnering together to try to provide more resources to the businesses here as we're all trying to navigate our way through these COVID-19 times. So one question, we did have someone who reached in and asked about how long it takes to get scheduled. And I think that Richard just talked about that. Anything else you wanted to add to that though, Richard?
Yeah, it depends on who we match you up with and what their schedule is. You know, that's a moving target, so it's hard to say. But usually we do it, and it's about a week out generally. And I say that with a disclaimer, right? You never know, but that's a good rule of thumb.
All right. Thanks again, everyone.